This video will provide an overview to Chapter 8 in the textbook, Introduction to Biblical Interpretation. This chapter deals with general rules of hermeneutics applied to poetry. The chapter breaks down into four major heads: dynamics of poetry, structure of Hebrew poetry, language of poetry, and larger units of poetry. Let's take a closer look at dynamics of poetry. The first page of the chapter underscores the importance of becoming familiar with and adept at interpreting poetry within the Bible, because approximately 1/3 of the Bible is expressed in poetry. The authors point out that while we would normally limit this to books like Psalms or Proverbs or Job or Ecclesiastes, we want to be aware that poetry surfaces in other portions as well. Within the Old Testament, one of the most extensive types of literature in the Old Testament, in addition to the standard poetry books, involves the oracles or sermons delivered by the prophets. So extensive sections of Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Hosea will be expressed in poetry. In addition, the authors point out that there are portions of the New Testament in poetry as well. As we approach Hebrew poetry, it's worth being aware that it is not constructed in the same way, by the same telltale signs as English poetry is. English poetry is often indicated by end rhyme, not always, but often, rhyming words at the end of lines. This is not a feature in Hebrew poetry. Instead, as they will explain a little bit later, parallelism is a main sign of Hebrew poetry. Something that Hebrew poetry has in common with poetry in other languages is an increased use of imagery, and to this feature traces much of the richness of poetry. Particularly then, a poet will take an abstract idea, like for example anguish, and will portray it with imagery that is intended to be recognized as figurative, not literal. That's fundamental as we navigate the interpretation of poetry as a particular genre. I'd like to call your attention to page 638. Page 638, the authors have reproduced a bit of Nahum's oracle, and notice how it's expressed. This comes through in the Hebrew, it comes through well in translation in addition. Notice how rapidly it moves. There's a staccato feel to it as the prophet describes the acceleration of a battle scene. The crack of whips, the clatter of wheels, galloping horses and jolting chariots, charging cavalry, flashing swords and glittering spears, many casualties, piles of dead, bodies without number, people stumbling over the corpses, all because of wanton lust of a prostitute, alluring the mistress of sorceries, who enslaved nations by her prostitution and peoples by her witchcraft. So this portrayal with rapid fire description, some of it literal and then some of it figurative, to describe the demise of a nation. Through this carefully crafted expression, poetry is capable of creating a sense, an atmosphere, an emotion that strict prose is unable to deliver. As we work with and listen to portions of Scripture that are poetic, we want to let the richness and the power of it penetrate us, and in that fashion we'll be in a better position to apprehend the full message that God has for us through a given passage in poetry. The authors point out that the Hebrew writers will carefully use alliteration and assonance, that is, choosing words that have similar sounds at times in order to accelerate or accentuate the message they're conveying. This is part of the message that is difficult to translate into another language, which is part of the reason that we encourage you to learn Hebrew and Greek. Penetrating poetry in the original language is a rich asset to have. You can a little more easily sense the thrust of the message and certainly the impact of the emotion with which it's delivered as you have access to the original language. Commentaries, a good commentary will do a good job of unlocking some of this for us, but of course without the original language we're just one step removed from appreciating its immediate impact. On 373, the authors begin to explain more fully what is meant by describing Hebrew poetry as parallelism. The fundamental idea is that there will be a pair of lines, generally comprising a single verse, and we will find related content in the two lines. Sometimes the content is very similar. Sometimes line B will say something of the opposite of line A, and sometimes it will extend the information contained in line A, but we find that the lines are related. Some of the types of parallelism that I've just briefly outlined then are explained on 379 and following. One of the best pieces of advice that I've come across, particularly with regard to parallelism, when line B seems to restate with slight word change the same message as line A, this piece of advice from Robert Alter, who is a specialist in Hebrew poetry, is this: as you read line B, listen in case the poet may be saying, I'm telling you something more precise, more energetic, more impactful, more exquisite than what I told you in line A. My tendency as a hurried Westerner is to read line A, and when I find similar content in line B, I feel like the writer has wasted my time. Why are you saying the same thing twice? Robert Alter says, slow down, examine what has changed in line B, and then consider that carefully, for that's what the writer wants us to notice. Oftentimes, it represents an intensification of line A, and by pausing enough to notice that, we come away with a greater appreciation for the message which he's trying to convey. Toward the bottom of page 386, the writers give an example from Deuteronomy 32, verse 30. Again, bottom of 386. I think you'll quickly see how line B represents an intensification of line A. Line A reads, how could one man chase 1,000? Line B, or two put 10,000 to flight. Now, if we were, first of all, let's acknowledge that they're saying something similar. A small military unit is able to execute an extraordinary victory proportionally. But wouldn't we expect that if one can chase 1,000, wouldn't two chase 2,000? So when the second line brings the benefit not of 2,000 but 10,000 put to flight, here we just have an exponential blast off. So the writer, by including a similar line, adding a similar line onto line A, but ratcheting up the intensification, we're able to kind of channel into that poet. We're able to get on his wavelength and realize that he is describing a stunning military rout and wants us to be amazed by the wonder of it. How could this happen? It's a rhetorical question. So he's wanting to be sure that we are duly amazed. And that's the reason for the intensification in line B. So please, I commend to you Robert Alter's advice. When you come to line B of parallelism, especially if it's synonymous parallelism, not saying the opposite. Some lines B will say the opposite of line A for contrast, but if it's saying the same thing, see if it isn't an intensification or somehow calling attention. Sometimes it will use a more exquisite or rare word in line B. Line A might say rock, general category. Line B might say flint, which is more specialized. We see this in Psalm 114. Notice on page 390, second paragraph down, the reference to a feature called chiasm. Chiasm. Chiasm occurs when the sequence of concepts in one line is reversed in the sequence of the next line. Study this out to appreciate it. Sometimes chiasm, or this inversion of sequence, extends beyond 2 lines. You can see a bit of a pattern there on 390, and then over on 391, second paragraph, they called it extended chiasm, meaning it goes beyond just 2 adjacent lines. An example, a larger example of extended chiasm is shown on 392, 393. Sometimes we call this palistrophic structure. A palistrophe applies to an extended chiasm so that people don't get it mixed up with just a short little 2-line inversion. As far as the purpose of chiasm, it's largely for interest and variety. That's when it's just on a narrow basis of, say, 2 lines where words or concepts are reversed order in the second line. When we're working with an extended chiasm, that is a palistrophe, such as on page 393 or 392, one of the functions that we need to appreciate is that the poet is drawing attention to the core. So if we're looking at 392, attention is drawn to letter E, which is a solitary pivot. I brought you to an orchard land to eat its lovely fruit. Since that's the centerpiece, the pivot point, in the scheme of Hebrew poetry, the writer wants us especially to notice that, sort of like a crescendo, and that's why the authors have put that in caps. On 393, we have not a single pivot point, but a double. So we have the letter L and L prime, corresponding to verses 4:16 and 5:1. As I look at this, it looks attractive, and it may look quite convincing on paper. You may hear a hesitation in my voice because as I look at this, I notice that not all parts are balanced in terms of length of material. Notice, for example, the length at point K. This is Song of Solomon, chapter 4, verses 8 to 15 makes up line K, and K prime, the balancing piece, is not even 1 line in length. Chapter 5, verse 1, parts B and C. It's conceivable that this is correct, but it's suspicious because a stronger, a more persuasive palistrophic scheme would have equal length of corresponding parts. If you have a 2-verse portion, its corresponding part should be 2 verses in length. If you have a 1-verse portion, corresponding part should be 1 verse in length. That's the general rule for a well-balanced or well-constructed palistrophe. So I just point out to you that not every palistrophe that people propose is necessarily valid. It's possible to impose the palistrophic structure on any stretch of verses. We have to be careful to test the proposals to see if the content of balancing portions is genuinely related.